Okay, so today we're going to be using oil paint, and I guess some of the things that we need to talk about first are some of the characteristics of oil paint. So it's very similar to acrylic paint in a lot of ways, only it's a lot richer, both in terms of its texture and in terms of its colour. You can even just see here from the squirted out bits of oil paint that it really holds its form, and that's because it's really thick. It's made from oil as well, whereas acrylic is made from glue. There are a couple of benefits to that. So first of all, it won't dry as quickly as acrylic, and that makes it a lot easier to blend. Because it's so thick, we can also use that to utilise texture within our work, and our colours are going to be a lot more rich and less opaque. I know that with some hues of acrylic, sometimes they go a little bit see-through and we don't fully get the density of colour that we want. Also, the processes that we use then with oil paint are going to be different. Because it's made from oil, obviously it resists water, so we can't use water to clean our brushes, and we can't use water to dilute it either. So we use two different substances when we're working. One of them is linseed oil, which is this, and that's just going to help thin the paint out in areas so that you can get really smooth marks. It also helps with the drying process a little bit. So whenever you're using oil paint in very specific areas that need a very defined line, you might use a little bit of this just so that your brush is lubricated and it can move freely and it doesn't dry up. The other thing that we use is white spirit, and that's just a chemical that helps us to clean our brushes. When you're cleaning your brushes, all you need to do is dip it into the white spirit and then use a cloth or some newspaper to pull the excess off the end of your brush, and that should get all of the paint off. But if not, you just keep on repeating that process. We tend to have the white spirit out when we're working, but you wouldn't use it in the same way that you would water. So you wouldn't dip in it and then dip in the paint. You would tend to use just a piece of a paper towel to pull the excess paint off your brush. When I'm working, I tend not to use a paper towel too much because I just consider the amount of paint that's on my brush, but today I'll show you the process of doing that anyway. So I'm looking at this image, so I've got my outline here, and the first technique that I'm just going to show you is just a simple blending technique, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about colour first. So when using any colour palette, if you've got the primary colours, you can tend to make any other colour. But that sometimes becomes a little bit difficult depending on the quality of the primary colour that you've got. So sometimes the blue has little pigments in it that might not mix a purple right when you put it with red. So if you do have a range of colours like I've got here, then try to utilise those to help you with the skin tones. If we're looking at a darker skin tone, the colour that we would tend to use is this one, which is called raw sienna. And we would just mix that with a little bit of this yellowy colour, yellow ochre this one's called. And then where we want it to get lighter, we could just add a little bit of white to that. And then with that colour, depending on what you're looking at, you'll just change that with larger quantities of this brown or the yellow, or maybe some red or some light yellow, depending on the quality of the tone that you're looking at. If you're wanting to darken it, you won't use black, because then if you add white to it, then you'll get a very grey finish. So you will use this colour, which is called raw umber, and that looks black on the palette, but it's actually not. And then you can see that that gives us a nice graduation between those three colours. Obviously, with any piece of work that you're doing, what you want to focus on is getting the right tonal contrast so that you can make something look 3D. And when you're doing that, you're going to want to graduate from one tone to the next, which is where blending comes in useful. So I'm just going to show you a blending technique now. I'm just going to use this piece of paper to take my excess paint off there. So I'm not worrying too much about colour now because I just want to show you the techniques. So if I'm taking this colour, I'm just going to pop it onto my image where it's a little bit darker. So around here like this, and you can see that my brush is a little bit dry, so that's the point at which I might use a little bit of linseed oil, but I don't want to thin it out. I just want to get it running smoothly. So I'll make sure that I've got a lot of density of colour in there. And then once I apply that, like so, then to blend a colour, it's a lot simpler than acrylic because this isn't drying yet. So that's going to stay wet for quite a while. So then if I take the excess of that colour off, and then I get a lighter tone, even if I go really light, and I place that next to it, just like that. Obviously I don't have a blend at the minute, But then what I can do, and there's two ways of doing this. I tend to do it all using the same brush, but it might be easier for you if you get a new brush. I just adjust the pressure that I'm applying where these two colours meet, and I'll just work over the top. So at the minute I'm just softly stroking where those two colours meet, and you can see that the colours are starting to blend together. And that's because both of the colours are wet and they're starting to create their own tone by mixing together. So a lot of your colour mixing when you're using oil can actually be done on the painting as you're working. And then let's say I want to go to this side and I want to add in a darker tone. And I pop that in there. And then you can see there's a very clear transition at the minute. But I take off my excess paint and then I just lightly touch where those two colours meet. Like this. And those two colours start to blend together. And this really allows you a little bit more than acrylic to keep on working into areas and to pick up some of the different changes in tone. So I can see that there's a little patch on the skin there, so I'm going to put that darker tone in. And obviously if it just sits there exactly like that, it looks really unnatural. But then if I start to blend it by working softly with my brush around the edges, it starts to just bring a little bit more variation to the image. And we get rid of that idea that we can simply just graduate from one tone to the next and have that look realistic. And even if I go with my purest white here and I add that on like that, obviously the colour's mixing from my brush a little bit, I can still just softly work that in and get those colours blending together like so, because they're gonna mix other tones. One thing that you do have to be careful of when you're doing this is the amount of paint that you're applying. So if I take a big piece of paint like that, and that's really thick, when I go to mix those two colours together and blend them, the white's just going to overwhelm it. So it's going to take a lot more work to get these to blend together in a smooth transition. What you might want to use thick pieces of paint for though is to add texture to your work. And that's great, but you just need to be conscious that where the blend meets, you need to have the same amount of paint on either side. So let's take that for an example. So I've got a lot of white there, and then I put a lot of burnt sienna there. That means that when I mix in the middle, and I want this texture, but if I'm adding any texture, I want it to follow the contours of the face. So I'm going to make sure that my marks are curved like this so that they show that that part of the face is curved. Where those two colours meet, because there's equal quantities of white and burnt sienna, just touching them lightly is going to help to get a blend in there. And even though there's texture, and even though I've got a lot of paint, because the quantities were equal, I'm going to be able to start to blend those together like so. And you can see that you get a really rich surface on the paint there, which can be really beneficial when considering your visual language and what you're wanting to say. So let's say I was looking at mental health and I wanted the viewer to feel the discomfort of the subject, then by making these types of marks on the skin, I would create a sense of agitation and overwhelm so that the viewer equally started to feel that too. Another thing that you can do when you're adding texture, I'm just following on the techniques here, is use a hard bristled brush. And what you'll find with that is that when you put your marks on, you can see your brush strokes are left in there a lot. I need a little bit more paint there. Oh, wrong colour. So that you can start to use the trace of your movements to help describe the piece. And you can see here I'm not using the technique where I wipe off my brush, but what I am relying on is just constantly adjusting my pressure so that I know how much paint I'm putting on and what's going to touch the surface. And obviously I've been doing this for a long time, so you guys might find it more difficult at first, but as long as you're considering those things, the nature of the paint, how much paint is on your brush, how hard you're pressing down, the direction of your marks and the swiftness of your movement, you'll start to find that you can capture some of these techniques really easily. Obviously that's not in keeping with this image, but I've started to show you here how to get texture and how to get tone in your work. When we're working on the more precise areas, let's say around the eyes, obviously you're going to move to a smaller brush, and that's where we're probably going to use a little bit more linseed oil. So with the eye, I would always start with the point furthest away from you. So that's going to be, in most cases, the white of the eye. And I say the white of the eye, but it normally has a little bit of a tint in it that dulls the tone down. So I'm going to use a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of black for that, to just make it a grey colour. And then using my linseed oil so I get a smooth brush stroke, but not so it goes see-through, I'm just going to start to use the tip of my brush to add those areas in. And this is where it starts to work a little bit more like acrylic and watercolour, in that you can get those really precise brush strokes. And then I'm going to get some of the brown, again a little bit of linseed oil. I'm going to mix it to make it a little bit darker, and I'm going to add that into the eye as well, like this. And the beauty of oil paint is that any mistakes that you make, because they're not dried, they're not set in stone, you can just keep on working through them, and it really helps you to understand that process of reviewing what you're doing and then refining it by changing your approach. That is a must though. We must change our approach if something's not going right. If we just try and do the same thing over and over again, so I'm just adding some black now, again thinking about the pressure that I'm applying. But if we do the same thing over and over again, we're just going to get the same results. So we always have to adjust what we're doing to try and make it a little bit more accurate. And then I'm going to go to the inside of the eye here. I can see that that's really dark because I'm not making any assumptions. I'm always referencing my image. And then I'm going to get some black to go around the top part of the lid. And there's little bits in here that I think I'll improve in a second. I think I need a little bit more tonal variation and density. But you can see that it's really starting to come together. One mistake that I'm not going to make, that everybody makes, the bottom eyelid doesn't have a dark outline, it tends to have a light outline. So make sure you have a look, you check that, and then you pop that in as necessary. Just one nice long smooth line like that. In here now I can see that there's a little bit of a lighter tone there. I've got some on, so I'm just going to add a little touch of that. You can also see that there's a little bit that curves around a little bit more, so it's a little bit whiter there. And I would just keep on working around that area, consistently looking at the picture and trying to improve it, applying either my small details using a little brush and more linseed oil, and then blending on the surface. And then around that I might use some of these blending techniques where I'm putting the two colours next to each other and pressing lightly where they meet, or I might even start to introduce some texture by applying thicker paint and really thinking about the movement of my marks. But that's a quick introduction to oil paint and how to use it. If you have any questions, please just contact myself on Teams or your teacher directly and she'll be able to help you.